Welcome to the Liberalism Conference 2016. I'm very pleased to see all of you here today, and I hope all of you got a chance to grab something to eat before our conference starts. My name is Ira Azhari, and I work in the research unit at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, and I will be your MC for the conference today. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in very interesting times. In Malaysia and around the world, freedom is under threat by forces internal and external. The irony is that threats to liberty does not only exist in ultra-conservative societies. We are all aware of the alarming popularity and really rapid rise of Donald Trump in the US. The recent Brexit debate in the UK revealed divisive, racist rhetoric that overshadowed the very real concerns of EU membership. And most recently, regional elections in Germany saw the far-right anti-immigrant Alternative for Germany party gaining significant number of votes, even in the capital city of Berlin. These worrying trends show that liberty, tolerance, and freedom need to be defended at all costs, regardless of which part of the world that we live in. Back home, right here in Malaysia, our liberty is being threatened in many different ways. The past year saw billions of taxpayers' money being laundered from a state-owned corporation, the passing of the National Security Council Act that severely infringes fundamental liberties that are guaranteed by our Constitution, and politics continue to be an avenue to showcase racial and religious superiority in order to win votes. Our beloved country is facing challenging times. One can argue that we are moving in the wrong direction. This conference cannot come at a better time. Our theme this year, Can Liberalism Save Malaysia?, seeks to explore how liberalism principles can be applied in a country that is as complex and as multidimensional as Malaysia. We cannot guarantee we can find answers in a one-day conference, but that is besides the point. At Ideas, we have always believed that providing a platform for dialogue is the first and most important step towards creating change. To kick things off today, I would like to invite our Chief Executive Officer, Mr. Wan Saiful Wanjan, to give his opening remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that, Ira. Firstly, welcome to the second conference on liberalism conference organized by Ideas. The first one was organized last year, and we had a very good turnout, and I'm happy to see so many of you here today. I hope we will have a good conference today. I want to start this opening remark by firstly apologizing for being late. We use, we call it GMT, the General Malaysian Time, which always means we start late anyway. We are already about half an hour behind time now, and hopefully we can catch up throughout the day. Now, the Liberalism Conference is hopefully something that we can do on a yearly basis to check the temperature in the country vis-a-vis the state of liberalism in the country today. I think this is a contentious issue because the word liberalism itself is contentious in nature. There's so many people giving very different definitions of what liberalism is. For us at Ideas, we are very straightforward on what we mean when we use the word liberalism. We use the classical liberalism definition in general, but we are quite specific as well in terms of what we mean and how we apply that word when we do public policy analysis. We argue on the basis of four things: rule of law, limited government, market economy, and individual liberty. As Ira said, today there are so many challenges faced by people who are interested in the issue of liberalism. Number one is, of course, the definition itself is very much contested one. Interestingly enough, whenever people talk about liberalism in Malaysia, it is as if we're talking about anarchy. It is as if we're talking about the most common idea that will come up whenever people complain about liberalism somehow will revolve around sex. This is a sad thing about Malaysia today, where such a holistic philosophy is boiled down to a very narrow definition of, I still remember about 2 or 3 years ago when I gave a talk about what liberalism is. And the very first question, I spoke for about an hour defining what liberalism is. The very first question that was asked to me is, so do you agree if people go out to the street and stand up naked? I thought, where in the world did I use the word naked on the street in my presentation? But that was the first question that came up. Nobody questioned about the application of liberal policies in the economy, application of liberal policies in social life, in politics, and so on. And we see, of course, challenges in rule of law. There are some people who seem to be above the law, able to act with impunity. There are people, when we talk about the concept of limited government, we also see how the government is getting much bigger these days. Ira mentioned about the National Security Council Act that has become law, which gives the executive a huge amount of power that is more or less unchecked. When it comes to market economy, again, we see a rise of demands and calls for protectionism. When we talk about individual liberty, of course, this is a very contentious area again. And there is always a debate about whether and how far people should have liberty as individuals. But I don't want to be talking about this for too long. We're going to have 3 sessions touching on the 3 different areas, on social issues, on political issues, on economic issues. I hope we will have a good conversation. And I want to emphasize that today is not a day for preaching what liberalism is. If you see the lineup of speakers, we continue the tradition that we started last year, in which we are inviting people with a view on liberalism, rather than we are telling people what liberalism is. So I really hope that there will be a lot of debates, there will be challenges coming from the audience, and I hope there will be disagreements, because that's the way that we can get a healthy conversation going on. Let's hear from everyone. Let's see, most importantly, if when we use the term liberalism, are we actually talking about the same thing? And I really hope that the sessions where we have speakers from groups that are more usually attacking liberalism will be an interesting one later on. So let me just end by saying I want to say thank you very much to Friedrich Naumann Foundation, especially a foundation from Germany who is supporting this conference. So that's just me confirming that we do get foreign funding. We're quite proud of the fact that we do get foreign funding, to be honest, because it's not easy to get all these foreign funds. The process is very rigorous. And we do have to fulfill our KPIs and so on. But I want to say thank you very much to Friedrich Naumann Foundation for supporting us again. They have been a very strong supporter of our work, even from the days when we did not exist as ideas yet. So thank you very much for the confidence put in us, and I really do hope that the cooperation can continue. So with that, let's have a good conference. Thank you.
It's time now for me to introduce all of you to our keynote speaker for today. Dr. Razeen is an associate professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He is also the chairman of the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka. He obtained his PhD from the London School of Economics and served as an associate professor there as well. Delivering his keynote speech, Malaysia's Future in an Increasingly Illiberal Environment, please join me in welcoming Dr. Razeen Sally.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Ideas, for the invitation to be here today. The title I was given is Malaysia in an Increasingly Illiberal Environment. Now, I'm not Malaysian. I don't live in Malaysia. I've never lived in Malaysia. I live on Malaysia's doorstep in Singapore. And I come here now and then, not least for Ideas events. So please take my observations as those of a friendly but certainly not expert outsider. I will first talk briefly about the state of liberalism globally and in Asia to set the background context, and then talk about Malaysia specifically. Right throughout, I'm going to be referring to what I see as 3 interconnected liberalisms. There is political liberalism, there is economic liberalism, and there is social liberalism. So let me start with the background, the state of liberalism in Asia in particular, and I will start with those three liberalisms. So let's start with some basic definitions. Political liberalism, to me, from the time of John Locke onwards, begins with legal protections for civic freedoms, the right to free speech, the right of assembly, the right of association, all legally underpinned. And then it was extended to democracy, in quotation marks, one man or one person, one vote. Economic liberalism is about the freedom of the individual to produce and consume, guaranteed by individual property rights. And social liberalism is about the freedom of the individual in the broader social space, in the family, in the workplace, gender relations, and so on. And of course, none of these exist in hermetically sealed compartments. They're all interconnected. A word about the state of liberalism elsewhere in Asia. And at first sight, it does not look good in recent years. And let's start with the elephant outside this room, the People's Republic of China, where under President Xi Jinping, we have seen a sort of reversion to a much more politically authoritarian form of government and governance, as well as economic reform, heavily advertised at the third plenum a few years ago, but which has hardly got anywhere in the last few years. So from a liberal perspective, China does not look good. If we look at other ASEAN countries, liberalism seems to have gone into serious reversal in the Philippines since President Duterte took over, the Donald Trump of Southeast Asia. In Thailand, democracy has been reversed and there is no economic reform. The Communist Party in Indonesia is not relaxing controls. Burma, Myanmar has of course opened up politically, but the government seems to have little idea about genuine liberal reforms on the economy. If we look at South Asia, democracy in India seems reasonably secure, with some bumps, with, shall we say, some half economic reforms. But around India, democracy in South Asia is very fragile. In the Maldives, in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, some better news. The Middle East continues to be in flames. There is no democracy, and there's very little of the market economy in Central Asia. So that's a quick roundup of Asia. The good news, however, and this is over a longer sweep of several decades, is that as a result of the opening of economies in Asia and of their global integration, we do see more economic freedom in the round across Asia than was the case 2 or 3 decades ago. And that translates not just into multinationals coming into Malaysia and elsewhere, but also into ordinary people having more freedom to produce and consume. And they've exercised their animal spirits in all sorts of fascinating ways, particularly the younger generation. And that's much more evident in Asia than it is in the West these days. And that's the good news. I think what I mentioned at the Liberalism conference here this time last year was that this has largely come about for practical rather than ideological reasons. Excuse me, the paradox of economic liberalism in particular in Asia is that it spread as a result of what elites in this part of the world call pragmatism. It's not because they believe in Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek or have read their books. No politician in Asia carries Hayek's Road to Serfdom around in her handbag the way Mrs. Thatcher used to do in Britain in the 1980s. But governments having seen how previous ways of doing things failed, and having seen how other countries have done better, have copied. Just as, to a large extent, Malaysia has copied at least some elements of successful practice in Singapore over the years and decades. That said, economic freedom in particular remains heavily repressed right throughout Asia, all the way from street sellers having to deal with, thank you, Shifa, licensing problems here and there, to multinationals facing all sorts of restrictions to financial markets, energy markets, and so on. And what I would add is that one can't rely on pragmatism in quotation marks without a compass. And obviously, liberals among us here would argue that that compass should be a liberal one, because without a compass, one can fall for all sorts of passing fads and conventional wisdoms. Now, since the global economic crisis, and this is my final point by way of background, in a climate of much lower growth, much more tensions about distribution of wealth, which is where the inequality debate comes into play, we have seen an increase in government intervention around the world. In other words, a different mix of the state and the market, and very much in favor of the state with more restrictions on the market. It's happening in the West. It finds its echoes in Asia and other parts of the world as well. We see governments intervening more in fiscal policy, in monetary policy, in all sorts of micro policies, in financial markets, product markets, factor markets, trade policies. Ideology has changed as well. The pendulum has shifted in favor of Keynesianism and economic ideologies favoring market intervention. And all of that finds its echo in Asia. And this has been accompanied in the last few years since the crisis with, I'm not sure it's a turning of the tide, but certainly a stopping of the momentum of political liberalism, of democracy, and also of more social illiberalism as well. So we see that in the West with the rise of populist movements on both the far right and the far left, as well as politicians in the center retreating from open market stances and also saying more illiberal things about foreign workers and migrants in particular. And that also finds its echo in Asia. Even in Singapore, which relies heavily, even more so than Malaysia, on foreign workers, we've seen pretty drastic restrictions on foreign workers and a different kind of rhetoric on what really keeps Singapore going, although Singaporeans might not like to admit it. So, enough by way of background. Let me come now to Malaysia specifically, and if you'll excuse me, I'm going to make some reference to Sri Lanka as well and make a few comparisons between Malaysia and Sri Lanka, mostly to Malaysia's benefit, I hope. And I do that for two reasons. Firstly, although it might not show, I am half Sri Lankan. I was born and brought up in Colombo. Colombo is my hometown. And I spend a lot of time in Sri Lanka these days. I advise the government since the change of government last year. The main reason for the comparison is this. There are lots of similarities. Topography. Both were model British colonies. The British were very fond of both Malaya and Ceylon. They lavished much more attention of them per head of population than they did anywhere else in their empire. Both plantation economies until fairly recently. Both with, by Asian standards historically, fairly relatively high living standards, not as poor as other parts of Asia. and both, of course, with very complex ethnic mixes, sometimes combustible. Now, I'm going to take a chronological approach to the state of liberalism in Malaysia, and then talk a little bit about the future before I close. So let me start with that first decade after independence, until the riots here in KL in 1969. And that, of course, was the Tunku's decade, and what many people look back on nostalgically as a kind of liberal golden age in Malaysia. That's certainly the impression I get from Ideas literature. As an outsider, just doing a summary balance sheet of it, perhaps that was the time when politically liberalism had its heyday in Malaysia, with democracy seemingly entrenched, with civic freedoms protected. Socially, there was ethnic peace until the '69 riots. And economically, by the standards of other Asian countries, Malaysia was remarkably open and had light touch economic regulation. Sri Lanka had a similar decade, almost a decade, until the mid-50s, bearing in mind it had independence about a decade earlier than Malaya. One little side note, and I only learnt this about a year ago, the author of Sri Lanka's first independence constitution was Professor Sir Ivor Jennings, who was also the first Chancellor of the University of Ceylon just before independence. A crucial figure in the early years of Ceylon's run-up to independence and the first few years afterwards. He wrote the first constitution, as I told you. And what I learned late last year from a legal specialist colleague at NUS was that he is the effective author of the constitution you still have in place. I think it's popularly known as the Reed Constitution because it was the Reed Commission that drafted it. But the person, Mr. Reed, I gather, was a figurehead. And the person who was more instrumental in drafting it than anyone else was indeed Ivor Jennings. Now, forgive me for that slight digression. Back to the narrative. That liberal golden age, of course, was perhaps never as golden as some would like to portray. I'm not sure the Tunku was a full-blown liberal, certainly not in the economic sense. Of course, there was always an agenda of a Malay Malaysia, not a Malaysian Malaysia, and that accounted for the split with Singapore. And there was economic regulation, intervention here and there in agriculture, and also an experiment with infant industries that didn't work. But perhaps a more fundamental point than that, and again, let me approach it by way of Sri Lanka, and this is really a cultural point. The majority culture in Sri Lanka is Sinhalese. And the Sinhalese historically have been hierarchical, deferential, caste-based, and anti-business and anti-entrepreneurial. That's the tradition of Sinhala history. What you could call, paraphrasing Tocqueville, Sinhala habits of the heart. In Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he talks very much about mores, what he nicknames, what he dubs habits of the heart, that underpinned American institutions on the way to American success. In Ceylon, Sri Lanka, arguably it's worked the other way around. There have been long-standing cultural traits in the majority tradition that weakened and eventually overwhelmed institutional and constitutional arrangements with their liberal elements. So the question I have, given many similarities that strike me as an amateur between Sinhala culture and Malay culture, notwithstanding their differences in religion, is whether Malay habits of the heart gradually undermined and overwhelmed what liberal elements Malaya and then Malaysia was endowed with at and soon after independence. Let me come now to the next 40 years, a very long sweep from 1969 to Dato Sri Najib's assumption of the premiership in 2009. If I think of Sri Lanka during that period, this was a period of all-round reversal for liberalism. Politically, things became much more illiberal. There were fewer protections for civic freedom. Sri Lanka, of course, descended into ethnic fratricide. Economically, Sri Lanka had its experiment with the command economy every bit as extreme as Mrs. Gandhi's license Raj in the 70s, before partial liberalization since then. Malaysia, of course, has had a much better time of it during that 40-year period. It was politically stable. It had ethnic peace after the '69 riots. And of course, it took off economically in a way that didn't happen in Sri Lanka with export-oriented industrialization. Bear in mind that up to about 1965, the year I was born, living standards in Malaysia and Sri Lanka were about the same. Before that, Malaysia was poorer. Now average Malaysians are 4 to 5 times wealthier than average Sri Lankans. But during this period, of course, liberalism was decidedly mixed, had a mixed record here in Malaysia. Arguably, political liberalism went into reverse, particularly under Dr. Mahathir. The Bumiputra policy is and always has been profoundly illiberal. And that spilled over into the economy with all sorts of manifestations of Bumi crony capitalism, the GLCs accounting for 1/3 of GDP or more, the way privatizations were done, and other things besides. But, and this is where pragmatism, liberal pragmatism comes into play, from the mid-1980s, in response to a crisis, Dr. Mahathir opened up at least one part of the economy to foreign multinationals. And that part of the economy became and remains Malaysia's productive engine, which subsidizes all the other stuff. And which, one should add, has really enabled the rise of a services economy and indeed of an urbanizing middle class, including lots of Malays. So that's the liberal element in it. Let me now come to the more recent era, from 2009 to the present, which is, of course, the Najib era. And it seemed to start, for the first few years, on a liberal note. And following it from outside, there was, of course, a certain air of optimism. So the Prime Minister seemed to acquire political liberal colors by, what was it, announcing that he would repeal or revise the Sedition Act. So there was some whiff of political liberalism in the air. He said that he would tone down, even reduce the impact of Bumiputra policies. And of course, there was genuine economic reform in the form of the GTP and the ETP programs, and they did deliver good results. So it enabled those reforms, allowed Malaysia to arrest its decline in productivity, to increase private investment, and to attract multinationals back to the country, not least to Penang. And that held up a growth rate of about 5 to 5.5%, in addition to oil and gas and the export of plantation crops. But of course, this was always, politically inevitably so, going to be a half reform program. For it was inconceivable that UMNO would threaten its own existence with really far-reaching political or social reforms. And the economic reforms, in reality, skirted around the Bumiputra policy and did not really place any significant constraints on it. And we see that compromise with what I was over here a few times talking about last year, that Malaysia and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or you call it TPPA here, Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So on the face of it, the government signed up to a negotiation which might have led to some serious domestic reforms in opening up the Malaysian economy. And the TPP is the strongest, hardest trade agreement in 20 years. There's no doubt about it. But in reality, when the agreement was actually signed in October, November last year, and later ratified by the federal parliament here, Malaysia, of course, got significant carve-outs on precisely the areas of policies that are most sensitive for the government, on the Bumiputra policy, on the GLCs, and on public procurement. So therein lies that compromise. In the last 2 years in particular, that liberal hope seems to have been extinguished on all fronts, political, social, and economic. So in the run-up to the last election, and after it, and especially with the 1MDB scandal, we see liberalism in reverse in Malaysia. Politically, clearly there has been a concerted attempt to shut down investigations and dissent into what happened with 1MDB. There seems to have been a reinforcement of Bumiputra rhetoric, some of it pretty inflammatory, racially inflammatory. And the economic reform program has basically stalled. As I was telling one Saiful just before we started, I was on a panel with Dato Idris Jalil in Sri Lanka last month, where he was extolling the virtues of your Pemandu program and what wonderful results it's delivered and will deliver for Malaysia. And he goes around exporting it all around the world, and now in Sri Lanka. I was itching to ask him the obvious question, if it's worked so well in Malaysia, why is all this happening back in Malaysia? But being polite, I refrained. I desisted. So that quick run through 60, 70 years of post-independence history brings me up to the present and the future. And that will account for my remaining comments. Again, let me approach this by way of Sri Lanka. The argument that I make in Sri Lanka today, and this is also an argument made by a new free market think tank in Sri Lanka that only set up a few months ago. It's called Advocata. The argument that we make is that Sri Lanka now has perhaps the best opportunity in 40 years for a renewal. And this should be a liberal renewal on all fronts. It's an opportunity after the authoritarian creep of the previous government to inject more political liberalism, hopefully through a new constitution and through other legal protections, to make some progress on the road to ethnic reconciliation, and to liberalize and deregulate the economy in order to improve productivity and put Sri Lanka on a solid, sustainable growth footing for the benefit of the vast majority of Sri Lankans. Now, if that doesn't happen, and particularly on the economic front, if there are no new jobs, no serious investment, then the threat, the danger is that everything could go into reverse. Not just a stagnant economy, but a stagnant economy leading to a yearning for big man politics once again among the Sinhala Buddhist majority, for blaming the minorities for economic ills, and for going back to the exclusive embrace of China's very dirty, corrupt crony capitalism, rather than having or balancing it with good, solid relations with traditional friends in India and the West. So that's the argument I would make for Sri Lanka. Coming back to Malaysia, I think from a liberal perspective, those of us who feel we are liberals in the round, one would like to see more liberalism on political, social, as well as economic fronts. So let me go through all three before I close. Starting with political liberalism, I think from a liberal standpoint, Malaysia does need a return, perhaps to the spirit of its first decade, of a more genuine rather than sham political liberalism, and underpinned, of course, with legal protections for individual rights, civic freedoms, that is. Moving to the social front, let me now touch on a very sensitive subject, namely Islam. I hesitate slightly, but let me charge ahead in any case. And I do this certainly not as an expert, but as a concerned amateur and someone who happens to have been brought up as a Muslim in Sri Lanka. In my view, there is a problem with Islam globally. And it's very easy to shy away from it with lazy cliches about Islam being a peaceful religion and so on and so forth. The problem is not this. There are at least scores of millions of moderate Muslims who are perfectly reconciled to modernity. That's not the issue. The issue is that there is a minority who are, let's be frank about it, pure evil. And even more dangerously, there is quite a large minority of fellow travelers and useful idiots in the Ummah worldwide who make excuses for those who go around killing people, who are very narrow-minded, very bigoted, very judgmental, particularly when it comes to other Muslims, and who oppose everything to do with the West and modernity. Now, that is not true with global Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism, but it is a problem with global Islam. And of course, in particular, I am referring to the spread of this very noxious virus of Wahhabism and Salafism. I'm worried about the Muslim minority in Sri Lanka. It's only 8 to 9% of the population, but there have been these fundamentalist infiltrations into the Muslim community, which is making it more exclusivist, more intolerant, more judgmental about other Muslims as well as other communities. Very dangerous when you're such a small minority and when there are Buddhist extremists who want to take advantage of that. Perhaps even more dangerous when this kind of radicalization and Arabization of Islam has happened in a country where the majority culture have that religion. What I would like to see in both Sri Lanka and Malaysia is a return of Islam to its roots. And I think this is very important. Islam came to coastal South Asia and to Southeast Asia via trade. In other words, it was part of modernity from the beginning. It did not come by the sword as it did across the Middle East to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and to North India. So I would like to see Islam return to its roots. And please don't read me wrong. I am not making a French-style argument here. I'm not arguing for the banishment of Islam to some kind of minuscule private space and taking burqas and bikinis off women. That is a profoundly illiberal approach. The French tradition, the secular tradition, has never been liberal. It's always been warped. I'm arguing for something very, very different, where religion does have its rightful place in the public square, but it requires reforming and civilizing. Let me come finally to the economic aspect of liberalism, which is what I know best, perhaps. I think Malaysia does need a liberal rejuvenation on the economic front, which is at least as important as what should happen on the political front and the social front. So it needs a much stronger version of both the GTP and the ETP. It needs restrictions and the eventual removal of the Bumiputra policy, which is profoundly illiberal because of its discriminatory elements. It needs more opening up of its economy. in which the TPP, if ratified by the US Congress, might be of some help in the longer term. All of these things, I think, would be good for economic freedom and prosperity in Malaysia. And there's an extra twist to it, which is this. Malaysia is now probably the most advanced developing country in the world. With a GDP per capita, it depends how you measure it, but it's around $15,000 per capita. Not that far off lower developed country standards. And what that basically means is that Malaysia is very deeply in that so-called middle income trap, because it can no longer grow with classic catch-up growth. With catch-up growth, all you need to do is to get some basics right, but you can continue to have authoritarian politics, bad governance, and other things besides. You can still have very high rates of growth. But when you reach a certain level of income, when you're in that upper middle income stratum, then you need to switch to a different kind of governance for growth. Because then deeper structural reforms to promote competition become much more important. The quality of your economic institutions, of public administration, of the law, of the judiciary, accounting, bankruptcy procedures, and so on, also become much more important. The political system becomes much more important because history shows that it's almost impossible to get those institutions right if you don't have a reasonably liberal political system. This is why I'm pessimistic about China's future. I don't think there is a long-term reconciliation between Mao and markets. So China is heading for real trouble within the next decade or two. And it requires open societies, in the sense that Karl Popper defined the open society, where you have genuinely free individuals who will have the gumption to be entrepreneurial. Precisely the thing Singapore lacks today. Singapore has got all the basics right, but it doesn't have entrepreneurial individuals, which is why it has to import so many foreigners. Including Malaysian Chinese, by the way. So Malaysia needs that kind of very difficult institutional transition, which is every bit as political and social, if it is to have continued economic success, because the danger otherwise is that Malaysia is going to be stuck with lower and persistently lower growth rates. And the danger of that is that if and when that happens, going below 5%, that distributional conflict will actually get much worse. And this will translate into racial and ethnic conflict. Similar links in the chain to what I mentioned about Sri Lanka. And of course, your dystopian prospect, if this does happen, is Sri Lanka during our period of ethnic civil war between 1983 and 2009. I'm not saying that Malaysia is anywhere close to that situation, but I remember in Sri Lanka growing up in the 60s and 70s that no one thought that this country that seemed to be doing well in the 50s and 60s would ever plumb those depths by the 1980s and the 1990s. So, to conclude, it might strike you that my liberal hopes for Malaysia might seem impossibly optimistic, indeed utopian, given your current situation. All I can say is that one should take the liberal stand on all those three fronts, political, social, and economic, not forgetting the economic, and then use opportunities as they emerge politically and socially. So what are those opportunities? Well, UMNO is probably irredeemable, but within the opposition, there are a fair number of political liberals and, by Malaysian standards, social liberals, but not that many economic liberals. That economic liberal element, I think, clearly needs strengthening within the opposition here, in at least two parties. Perhaps the third party is irredeemable as well. Similarly, in your NGO movement, which is far more vibrant and spontaneous and genuine than anything one sees in Singapore, again, there are lots of political and social liberals, but many of them also are perhaps soft economic authoritarians. So I think there should be a stronger economic liberal element there as well. And of course, what you have to take advantage of is this rising urban middle class, including a large body of Malays, that is the very product of opening up the economy, particularly from the mid-1980s. So I wish you well on all those fronts. Thank you.